it's been really a really interesting year based on the fact that we're seeing a continuance of where we've been, and we're seeing an introduction of some pretty new stuff it's been going on, I believe, under the covers, if you will, for a long time. But the last year has really brought it out into the open and made it very evident in ways that it wasn't before.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Caveat, the CyberWire's privacy surveillance law and policy podcast. I'm Dave Bittner, and joining me is my co-host Ben Yellen from the University of Maryland Center for Health and Homeland Security. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Dave.
Today, Ben covers a Seattle Public School District lawsuit against big tech companies. I've got the story of an AI avatar generator that just can't seem to resist sexualizing Asian women. And later in the show, Chris Gray, AVP of Security Strategy at cybersecurity firm Deepwatch, shares his insights on data privacy regulation in 2023. While this show covers legal topics and Ben is a lawyer, the views expressed do not constitute legal advice. For official legal advice on any of the topics we cover, please contact your attorney. And now, a word from our sponsor, SpyCloud, the cybercrime analytics leader. SpyCloud disrupts cybercrime by telling you what criminals know about your business and your customers, so you can take action to prevent ransomware, account takeover, and online fraud. SpyCloud constantly recaptures and analyzes new data from the criminal underground, including credentials, cookies, and PII siphoned from malware-infected devices. With knowledge of the specific data criminals have in hand from InfoStealer malware on managed and unmanaged devices, security teams can respond with a more efficient and effective process called post-infection remediation. Get SpyCloud's post-infection remediation guide outlining the 7 steps for preventing a malware infection from becoming a full-blown ransomware incident. Visit spycloud.com/cyberwire. That's spycloud.com/cyberwire. And we thank SpyCloud for sponsoring our show. All right, Ben, we've got some good stories to share this week. Why don't you kick things off for us here?
So I saw my story on GeekWire, and it is about a new lawsuit that's been filed. The Seattle Public School District is suing TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, Meta, and some other companies, seeking compensation for the youth mental health crisis. I'm going to start by saying what I always say about these cases, which I know is very frustrating. This is going to go on for years. We're not going to have a resolution for a long time. So just to get that out of the way.
Oh, goody.
I know. I wish we could have just a magistrate judge give us a preliminary conclusion tomorrow.
A legal lightning round?
Exactly. But unfortunately, that's not going to happen.
Right.
So the basis of this lawsuit is really interesting. Basically, what the Seattle School District is saying is our students have suffered from a basically decade-long mental health crisis. They have the statistics to back it up. That's all in the complaint. An increased number of students using mental health services, a higher suicide rate among teenagers, public school students in Seattle, and they're basically alleging that that's the fault of these big tech companies for poisoning the brains of students through social media. So they're suing basically the big purveyors of social media, Meta, Instagram, TikTok, saying that they have poisoned students' brains. They've particularly targeted young people because young people are a lucrative target for advertising purposes. And as a result, they've suffered a legally recognizable harm. I'm going to start by saying that I am very skeptical of this lawsuit for a number of reasons.
Okay.
For one, I'm not sure how you can basically, in order to prevail in court, the school district would have to prove that the proximate cause and the but-for causation of these increases in mental health spending, mental health care, suicide, et cetera, is students' use of social media. And there are so many co-founding factors. If you were to ask me informally, hey, Ben, how do you account for the increase in mental health services in the past 10 years in the school district? I'd probably say social media, sure.
Right.
But that's much harder to prove in a court of law. And if I'm an attorney representing one of these companies, I would say, You could attribute it to any number of factors. Maybe it's increased carbon emissions. Maybe it's political unrest. There are just a lot of reasons that students could be suffering a mental health crisis. So that's going to be very hard to prove. And then there's the question of standing.
Yeah.
So anybody suing anybody else basically has to have an actual stake in the outcome. You have to have suffered a particularized injury. And the injury has to be traceable to the alleged illegal action. Mm-hmm. And there has to be a level of redressability, basically a way for the court / the defendant to ameliorate the effects of the alleged injury. I think you might be able to make a case for injury in fact here. They do provide statistics. A 30% increase in the past 10 years in the number of students who said they felt sad or hopeless almost every day for 2 weeks or more in a row, that they caused them to stop doing usual activities. Maybe they'd be able to prove injury in fact, although I still think there's that causation problem. There are a lot of reasons why there could have been a 30% increase in the number of school students who felt sad and hopeless. And I'm not sure you're going to be able to pin that on social media companies. For their part, the social media companies are responding to this by saying, hey, we've done a lot in the past several years to make our platforms more accessible to youth, cleaning up bad accounts, shielding the youth, shielding young people from some of the worst aspects of the social media websites. So they are arguing that they should not be held accountable in this lawsuit. So I'm not sure that this is really going to go anywhere, but this is the first time that a school district, and not parents representing individual students, or we've seen a case that we've talked about where the social media companies have been sued for facilitating a terrorist attack. This is different than that because it's an entire school district. So I just found it to be a very interesting potential case, even though it's probably going to go into the proverbial legal trash can.
Does the school district at all outline what they're hoping to get out of this? Are they after money? Are they after changes in the algorithms? What do they want?
I think they're after money. I think they're asking for damages. I think, they probably would settle for some type of injunction, or really realistically, they could look for policy changes. So maybe it would force the threat of this lawsuit would force social media companies to curb some of the excesses of the addictive excesses of these social media sites as it relates to children. But they are seeking monetary damages because they're alleging that the school district itself has suffered some injury. If you have students with using increased mental health services, that's an overall cost and an added burden to the public school system,
right?
In a financial sense. And I think you could allege more diffuse harms, citing these statistics that students are more depressed, that are discontinuing normal activities. I think you could make an argument that that's a concrete injury against the school district that can be fairly compensated if they win this case. I don't think they're going to win this case. I think their best hope is settling, and a settlement might be get the social media companies to curb some of their more aggressive targeting of young people.
Could they say, could the social media companies say, we're putting together a consortium and we're going to fund, $100 million in mental health services for, online mental health services for students nationwide. So if anyone's feeling sad, they can log on and they'll be able to talk to an expert, and we'll pick up the bill for that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and while they're there, if they want to explore some of our site's wonderful features, communicate with friends, maybe click on a couple advertisements, we'd have no problem with that either. Yeah, I could see that being part of a legal settlement here.
Yeah.
There have been similar cases in different contexts in the past. One of them they talk about in this article is the Seattle School District suing Juul Labs over its marketing of e-cigarettes to youth.
Oh.
So that's another kind of diffuse injury that would be pretty hard to prove for a school district. But they pulled it off. They were able to reach a global settlement of a bunch of consolidated cases across the world, alleging that they, as a school district, suffered a legal harm based on students' addiction to Juul products. So it's not entirely out of the question. I just think drawing that explicit connection between the social media sites themselves and these pretty alarming statistics that they lay out here is going to be really difficult to prove, whether they're seeking an actual victory in a court of law or a settlement. And I think social media sites are going to come in and argue that there are so many co-founding factors here. There's no way you could ever definitively prove that a 30% increase in the use of mental health services is directly attributable to decisions we've made as social media companies, for example, to market to high school students. So in that sense, it's just kind of it just seems unlikely to succeed from my perspective. Maybe I'm being too cynical, but
you?
I know. I wish there was like a betting market for these types of things. Where
that's what we need, Ben, is more betting.
More gambling.
Because I haven't seen enough ads for that
Legalized
lately.
Sports betting was just instituted in Maryland, so I may or may not have blown a few dollars on it. The other funny thing about this for me is I watch a lot of Law & Order. It's kind of like a fun thing that I do with my wife. And usually within the first 20 minutes or so, if they've identified who did it, who committed the murder or whatever, our question is always like, all right, well, what happens in the next 40 minutes? This is an hour-long episode.
Right.
And it's always about suing somebody. It's like, all right, they're suing the manufacturer of the antidepressant that caused the person to commit this crime, or the leader of this biolab who did unlawful experiments on the alleged perpetrator. And I'm just like, this could be a Law & Order episode where, a high school student commits a heinous crime and we find out who did it in the first 20 minutes. The last 40 minutes is the lawsuit against the social media companies. So, Dick Wolf, if you want to reach out to me for some writing credits, I'd be happy to oblige.
I'm just thinking of your dear lovely bride, sitting through an episode of Law & Order with you, nitpicking, all the things they get wrong.
Right. Although they do a better job than... I think they're wary of the fact that lawyers watch the show. So.
You think? You think they get letters?
They get a lot of letters. I mean, the most unrealistic thing to me part about that show, and I realize this is a tangent, is just how quickly everything is resolved.
Right.
Like,
in an hour.
There's a crime happens, there's a nice tidy case within a week, and we get, the sentencing 3 days after that.
Right.
It doesn't really work that way in our overburdened court system.
Do you think this suit from Seattle is the kind of thing that will attract attention from the usual suspects in Congress?
Yes, I do. Maybe not directly based on this lawsuit, but certainly if the lawsuit against my expectations goes anywhere, that might be more of an impetus for Congress to institute some type of regulation. The interesting thing is states have taken action recently against social media companies, but not for the reasons described in this lawsuit. We've seen states ban the use of TikTok on government devices, not because of the corrosive effect of social media, but because of their close connection with the Chinese government. What that does tell me is states, if they wanted to, really any jurisdiction, could take aggressive action against these social media companies. But the companies themselves are powerful. And like I said, the connection between social media use and some of the statistics that we're seeing, while they're very believable to me, and I certainly would expect that there would be some causation there, it's just very difficult to prove.
Right.
So even if you are a policymaker, it might be a difficult policy argument to make. And plus you have a lot of kids who really enjoy social media and a lot of social media companies who really enjoy all those advertising dollars. So it's an uphill fight.
Could the social media companies make a legitimate case that while there are some kids who find this harmful, there are other kids who find it very pleasurable and it's a positive influence in their lives?
You could absolutely make that case. I mean, they could hire their own statisticians and come up with their own statistics that refute what the Seattle School District is saying. That, 80%, and I'm just making these statistics up, but like 80% of users have reported learning more about global affairs because of their use of social media websites or have made new friends. I mean, I think there are positive effects that you could allege in court, and that would be just as provable as some of these negative effects. Mm-hmm. Again, I mean, my instinct is that it has been a major net negative for school kids.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. I just think there's a difference between what our opinion is and drawing that legal connection in court.
Yeah. All right. Well, this is an interesting one for sure, and we will keep an eye on it. We will have a link to that story in the show notes. My story this week comes from the folks over at MIT Technology Review, and this is written by Melissa Hakila. Apologies to Melissa if I butchered your last name there. And this is titled The Viral AI Avatar App Lensa Undressed Me Without My Consent. So, Ben, are you at all familiar with Lensa?
I was familiar with it, but not, I mean, reading this article made me more familiar with it.
Yeah, I only knew of it by name. I've never played with it or anything like that.
Right, I've never played with it either. Yeah. I knew it was out there in the ether.
Mm-hmm. So evidently this is one of, the many apps that are categorized as digital retouching apps. So this is you take a picture of yourself. I'm sure we've all seen pictures of our friends that are posted, and you say to yourself, "My goodness, what kind of filters have they run themselves through?" Because these are like they've smoothed out their skin to be unrecognizable. There's usually that to me that's the biggest tell with these sorts of things. And some of them they make your eyes bigger. They just do all the things that folks have found make you more attractive in a photo.
And eventually you say, this does not actually look like the person.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So Lensa added a feature that would generate avatars for people, and it would use artificial intelligence. So it would take photos of you, and it would come up with a artistically created, or what appeared to be an image of you that would have been created by an artist. In other words, something that is more painterly. It doesn't look like a photograph. It looks like a piece of art, right?
Right.
So the author of this article ran her image through this AI, and she got, of the 100 avatars that were generated, 16 of them were topless, and 14 of them had her in skimpy clothes and what she describes as overtly sexualized poses. Now, this is contrasted against her coworkers, her male coworkers, where when they ran theirs through the system, it came back with pictures of them being astronauts or athletes or all sorts of other professional types of things, but it did not revert to sexualizing the images the way that the images were for this woman. Now, she writes here, she says, "I have Asian heritage, and that seems to be the only thing the AI model picked up on from my selfies. I got images of generic Asian women clearly modeled on anime or video game characters." Now, the article goes on to say that they suppose that the reason for this is that these AI models are trained on these open source data sets, and these data sets are full of images that come from things like racist stereotypes, pornography, explicit images of rape, things like that are in these models. And so the model spits back what it was trained on. Just to step aside for a minute, I think it's fair to say that if you and I went on the internet, if anybody went on the internet and you did a search for Asian woman, chances are you're going to come up with a lot of these sorts of images.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, I guess a theme on our show and other people who've talked about AI is the ideal vision is it would remove some of the biases inherent in human-designed products.
Right.
But I think what we've found pretty definitively, and this article is kind of the nail in the coffin here, is that all of the biases and discrimination and deleterious effects of over-sexualization and racism, et cetera, all of those things that exist in the real world, you can't remove those from artificial intelligence because it's the inputs here, which is the open source, what am I trying to say?
Libraries.
Right, the open source libraries, it's garbage in, garbage out. So I think the broader lesson here is that AI is not going to solve our societal problems. You can try and train something to be unbiased, but in its natural state, it is going to reflect what's been put in it. And what's been put in it, if you spent any time on the internet, is some of what this author alleges in this article.
Yeah. It strikes me that it's kind of an uncomfortable mirror back on us, right? You know, it's in other words, we have this idea about ourselves of what we would like to be, this aspirational idea of what we would like to be and how we would like technology to reflect it. But when you actually send the technology out into the world to see and say, hey, what are humans like? This is what you get back, and it ain't great.
Right. It's kind of depressing. It's like we're getting confirmation from an artificial system that we as a society are screwed up and have prurient and somewhat racially biased desires and internet habits. Yeah, I mean, it is kind of a poor reflection of us as a society, but it also, to me, shows the limits of AI generally. Certainly, this is not the only context we've seen where the promise of artificial intelligence runs into the reality that AI is just as biased as we are as conscious human beings. So I think this story is really just an extension of that. We've seen it in the context of law enforcement where artificial intelligence ends up being biased against racial minorities. We've seen it as it comes to things like predictive policing, where the algorithms themselves end up being statistically biased in one way or another. Facial recognition software, we've talked about that a good deal on this podcast. So yeah, I mean, if you understand it less as an ideal version of ourselves and more of an accurate reflection of how screwed up we are, or, to put it more charitably, all of our fallacies as human beings, I think that's a better way to view AI. And I think it's incumbent upon policymakers to more closely align our vision with what actually ends up being put out there. And to do that, I think you have to pay more attention to the inputs, what goes into these open sources of data. But, frequently you want to get the largest universe of data into the system that the algorithm is going to use. And the larger the universe, there should be some law of nature about this, but the larger the universe of data, the more screwed up that data is going to be.
Right. It's Yellen's theorem.
Yellen's law. Yeah. Yellen's law of the internet.
That's right.
Copyright.
Yeah, I wonder too, to what degree does this reflect the notion, I'm pretty sure we've talked about it here before, about the whole idea of operating at scale, right? That if we were running a system like this at a scale where humans were reviewing the output before sending it along, right, and saying, "Ooh, wow, that's no good,"
right.
or reviewing the input before putting it into the AIs to do their thing and saying, "Yeah, maybe we shouldn't include that." But that's not how any of this works, right? You'll talk to the technologists and they'll say, "Well, we can't do that at scale."
Right.
And my response to that has always been, "Well, then maybe you shouldn't do that." Right?
Yeah, I mean, it would just be impossible to do. We've seen it a little bit with ChatGPT, where they've actually tried to protect against some of their worst potential outputs. And so they've done things like, they will not answer requests to build Molotov cocktails, for example. But people have found ways around it, and there aren't enough humans to correct some of these problems and protect against bad outputs when you're talking about a system that's operating at such a large scale. It's just not practical.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's absolutely the problem. If you build a system that has so much promise, part of that promise is we have access to so many sources that go into our inputs, and I think the natural consequence of that is going to be that you get a lot of the garbage that's out there on the internet.
Yeah.
I think we've seen that in a bunch of different realms. I think there's, your ultimate point in saying that maybe we just shouldn't do this, I think is certainly valid. There's value to artificial intelligence. I think people use it not just for nefarious purposes.
Sure.
There's value to things like ChatGPT. I think it could have a societal benefit if used in the right way. We just have to solve this dilemma of do we really want to maintain this mirror where the output in these artificial intelligence system accurately reflects who we are as a people, and we're not liking what we see? Is there any way to correct against that when we're talking about such a large scale? And that's not an easy problem to figure out.
Yeah. This article quotes Aylin Kaliskin, who's an assistant professor at the University of Washington, who studies biases and representation in AI systems. And they say the stereotypes and biases it's helping to further embed can also be hugely detrimental to how women and girls see themselves and how others see them. I think that's right on.
Very profound. Yeah. I mean, and I think that's ultimately what's going to be the biggest negative effect out of all of this is it just perpetuates these stereotypes. If you can't even escape them in an artificial universe, how are we ever going to overcome them in the real physical world?
Right.
So I think that's absolutely the long-term consequence of this. I think that's a very profound quote.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will have a link to this story in the show notes. Again, we would love to hear from you. If there's something you'd like us to discuss on the show, you can email us. It's caveat@thecyberwire.com. This episode of The Cyberwire is made possible in part by Strider Technologies. Strider is the first strategic intelligence tool built to help companies, government agencies, and research institutions protect their innovation and compete in a new era of global strategic competition. With trillions of open-source data points, Strider's technology and intelligence solutions enable you to proactively identify, manage, and respond to state-sponsored intellectual property theft and supply chain risks. Learn how to secure your technology talent and supply chains at striderintel.com. Ben, I recently had the pleasure of speaking with Chris Gray. He is AVP of Security Strategy at cybersecurity firm Deepwatch. And our conversation centers on where he thinks data privacy regulation may be going in 2023. Here's my conversation with Chris Gray.
2022 has been, in many ways, a continuation of 2019, 2020, the last few years. A lot of the same issues that we had been facing have absolutely continued. But this last year, we've also had a pretty significant rise in what I'm going to call geopolitical hacktivism, whatever you want to call it, but where we've got definite malicious use activities that are in place based around the conflicts going on around the world, etc. So it's been really a really interesting year based on the fact that we're seeing a continuance of where we've been, and we're seeing an introduction of some pretty new stuff that's it's been going on, I believe, under the covers, if you will, for a long time. But the last year has really brought it out into the open and made it very evident in ways that it wasn't before.
And what about movement from nations around the world, here in the U.S. and elsewhere, in recognizing that we've got to make some changes when it comes to privacy and security?
Well, so from a privacy perspective, that's been visible. That's been something that's been heavily observed. All going back GDPR and everything rolling forward, and we can talk about that more in detail. But one of the areas where we're seeing within the United States, for example, a large amount of activities that are going on. You can look at what DHS and CISA, the new roles and rules that they're rolling out for minimum baselines for critical infrastructure. You can look at the FTC reporting requirements for public companies. You can look at some of the cyber bulletins, some of the cyber framework ideas that are coming out of the Biden administration, like they come out for every president. But there is a large amount of information that is now being released in a much more aggressive fashion than probably what we've observed in the past. So I believe the awareness from that security baseline, it's absolutely there, and the help is coming out. It comes with its strengths and its weaknesses, obviously. And then again, from a privacy perspective, we are seeing more and more teeth attached to privacy regulations, more and more protective regulations. And the interesting thing to me is we're starting to see it inside of the United States, which had a significantly different privacy model than what was commonly seen in Europe. We're seeing more of that European tact being adopted inside the United States.
Well, let's dig into that some, because you talk about GDPR, of course, covering the EU, but it seems to me that here in the States it's been much more of a state-by-state kind of thing, and we haven't really gotten any traction at the federal level. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Yes, it's absolutely a fair way, although there has been motion within the last year leading up into 2023. In many ways, when you're looking at privacy rules that are brought out at the federal level in the United States, the federal government tends to take what I'm going to call the foundational ruling, or the low water mark, if you will. These are the foundational baselines that are required, as opposed to I set the floor, I don't set the ceiling. But you do have a number of things which are pulling forward this year. You had the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, which was submitted back in May of 2022 by a bipartisan group. It has not passed yet, but the fact of the matter is it was submitted as a consideration for law. You've got the SEC with the new privacy and security requirements that they're pushing through, which, according to some, may actually go out and effectively include updating the COPA standard. These are things that the federal government is doing around this. There's still more to be done, but the fact that those rules are popping out, along with, like we said before, Department of DHS and CISA, they're putting out alerts every day, new security foundational baselines, aligning the NIST cybersecurity framework to minimum capabilities that are expected across areas of critical infrastructure. You can look at the cyber insurance considerations that are currently being looked at by the government as to whether or not the federal government needs to step in to establish ubiquitous coverage for all, or the capability to obtain it. There are a lot of things that are moving inside the U.S. federal government right now. They're just still a little bit, I think, in their infancy, but I think we'll see more motion on that with certainty in 2023.
What is your sense in terms of the appetite for increased regulation here when it comes to privacy? Or are organizations, is it a matter of acceptance? Or are they looking forward to these sorts of things? Or are they fighting it tooth and nail? Where do we land?
That's a yes to all the above, and a geopolitical answer.
Okay. I'm
going to paraphrase and take this to a very high level, but there are different privacy models that have existed around the world over the last years. You have the U.S.-centric model, which in many cases almost translates into you have to prove to me why I should not be allowed to have your sensitive information. You have the European model, which is you have to prove to me why I should ever surrender my personal information to you. And then you have what I call the rub model, and that's where you have nations that are kind of stuck between the two, and they're trying to navigate the shark-filled waters to conduct business and operations there. In Europe, the push for more and greater privacy is a common thing. We're seeing it, again, going back to GDPR, which is a standard that far surpasses anything that we'd seen in the United States to that date. It was a common thing. Inside the United States, there's been significantly more pushback, with the exception of, when I say this, there will be people who will roll their eyes, but, California's been leading the way on many of the privacy regulations. And you'll hear people in the United States, oh, yeah, that's just California being California, making it hard to do business. Well, is it really, though? The difference being there, it's that very critical mindset of what is privacy and to whom does it belong and how critical is it? And there are different views. So I would say there are a fair number of people that look at it and say, this is getting in the way of me making money and me doing business, and the regulations are in the way and I don't need them. And then similarly, you're going to have people who are going to say, no, these are the foundational basics of how we should interact as human beings and how individual identity should be respected. What's the answer? Ask me in a decade, because it's still very much up in the conflict mode. But I will say generally speaking, that the world is moving more and more towards that European model.
Are you seeing any interesting experiments around the world? Or are there any nations that are taking a novel approach to this?
Let's take a look over in the EU right now. We're seeing a renewed interest in protection regulations that are popping up. You've got the French blocking statute, which quite literally is saying, even though, there is GDPR, there are situations where, in addition to that or around the outside of that, there are things which should not be shared because they are potentially putting French national security at risk. So you're not allowed to do this, even if there's nothing else that says you're not. There's the transatlantic data privacy framework, which you're seeing that's popping up, and it's requiring adequacy decisions. You've got the standard contractual clauses, which have been around forever, but now, after December of this year, it's changing, and it's going to, they're getting rid of the old SCCs and you're having to put the new ones in. And these are directly going to affect the United States and, interestingly enough, now the UK, since Brexit, when they departed from the EU, they're kind of now in that not us category of the way this is going. Is that novel? Is that strange? Is that new? Not necessarily, but it's absolutely showing, if you will, the flexing of muscle of this is the way we do business. US, we understand your economy, we understand your power, but you're going to have to do it our way because this is how we're going to operate. And, the entire concept of the data transfer impact assessments, which are going to be flying back and forth very rapidly, where is it net new? No, it's something we've been doing after a fashion, but now the requirements are becoming more codified and more strictly enforced. So, there's significant play there. We can go over and we can look at China. China's put in place a lot of cybersecurity law, the data security law, the personal information protection law. They put a lot of standards in play, which the pessimists in the world, if you will kind of laugh and shake their head and say, well, yeah, but China, your laws protect you from us. They don't protect us from you. And I don't know that anybody's laws are any different, but it's just very interesting seeing, players, nations, organizations, whatever, that have historically had a very, we're the right, we're in the right kind of a mindset. And now the stage is getting very full with conflicting requirements, conflicting laws, conflicting approaches. And it's going to require a much more nuanced interaction, if you will, between those various standards.
Where do you suppose we're headed then? And who can take the lead in kind of, matching up all of these different requirements around the world and finding a common denominator?
Well, as I tell my children on a regular basis, if you ever want to understand why anything is done, find the money and follow it, because that's really a kind of a well-duh statement, if you will, but it is one that matters. I think one of the points that is going to drive the most interaction and the most give and take in this is going to be around international business, obviously. We all want to have, there's what we want, there's what we need, there's what we can live with. And I believe we're going to find ways to navigate this and come up with what is a minimal acceptable answer that will concede what needs to be conceded on both sides to allow us to get to where we need to be to spend money, work together, engage in trade, tourism, everything else of that nature. That is going to happen. It's going to be a back and forth over time. Is there any one organization that's going to be able to stand in and say, I'm in charge of this and I'm fixing it? No, I really don't think so. I think what it's going to come down to is you're going to see power brokers. And in that, you're going to see the United States. You're going to see the EU. You're going to see, various entities within the Asia Pacific area. You're going to see those pop up, and they're going to come together as players and try and drive through where they need to be. That's going to be really the future as I see it on this, because there is no single entity in the world that everyone's going to just agree to bow down to the regulations that come from them and say, okay, I'll do what you tell me to do.
What are your recommendations for folks in organizations who are responsible for privacy and perhaps security as well to kind of hedge their bets against the things that might be coming over the horizon?
Study, and start planning your approaches rapidly. Security is not privacy. Privacy is not security, but they both enable and are enabled by one another. They really can't exist in our connected world without, paying respect to one another. Anyone who's having to do this, you have to look at privacy as a driver for your security program. You enable privacy through the security controls and the practices that you put in place. And they're absolutely going to be necessary. So they need to be considered there. From a privacy perspective, the individuals who are responsible for that need to make sure that they're getting in front of the security teams and that they're making sure that the upcoming message, the intent, is understood, so that not only are we designing systems with security by design, but privacy by design is a significant cornerstone in how we're doing our development. We're seeing technologies that are popping into place now that, they're security technologies, but they're play and how they're going to be able to affect the outcomes of, the privacy community and everything that we're trying to do. They're anything but, inconsiderable. You've got, if you stop and you look, you've got everything from, we've got the quantum security stuff that's coming. We've got the biometrics and where all they're coming through. There are 8 laws being considered in the United States right now in 2022 that are directly attributable to, biometrics and the plays that are in there. You've got blockchain. You've got the various forms of encryption that are coming up right now that are absolutely designed towards how are we going to do a better job at it. But at the same time, when they come around, they're probably going to have the ability to completely nullify all the cryptography work that we've done in the past just by the advancements in technology. There are so many things coming, and we've got to have these two teams come together and make sure that true DevSecOps kind of a mindset, that we are working together from the initial stages to make sure that both needs are being addressed by the single solution.
I'm curious, I think certainly on the consumer side, you could make the case that folks feel a bit of resignation or surrender when it comes to having their privacy violated or, all their information soaked up. We have an endless stream of EULAs that we just click through, and who knows, what's being gathered up. But I'm curious, are you optimistic in the face of what I think is a lot of pessimism on the consumer side, certainly? Do you think that there's reason to have good thoughts about what might be in our future?
I absolutely do. I think a lot of the pessimism that you're talking about when you just click through that as well, it doesn't, there's a level of pessimism. It doesn't matter what's in this. I've got to click yes or I can't use this. And companies are going to do what companies are going to do. And I just might as well accept it. At least in the United States, that's the mindset. Again, in Europe, it changes, or not necessarily Europe, but in other parts of the world, it changes. But I think one of the things that we're going to be seeing, and it's very interesting as we do look at it, the rise in, artificial intelligence, the things like homomorphic encryption. There are a lot of ways, a lot of technologies, a lot of capabilities that are rolling out now that will allow what people refer to as, a cybersecurity mesh approach, where basically the effect of breaches is going to be minimized just due to all the interacting capabilities that, mesh together as a protective net, if you will. I think that is going to start to minimize the effect of loss where things are happening. I think that as privacy is becoming more critical, and as we've been talking about how it has to be a consideration from the start, I think you're going to start seeing it just part of the baseline design, and we're going to get better at it. I think also, to be thoroughly honest with you, if I address the security nihilist mindset of the breach is inevitable and it will happen, okay, if we accept that fact and we don't want to be in the pessimistic world, the other part of that is we're getting better at how we respond. We're getting better at our ability to detect when anomalous activity is happening, to respond to it and to minimize the impact, because we live in a world where it does happen. The idea that fewer incidents makes for a better world has been statistically proven to be wrong. The more incidents that you suffer, if you will, the better you get at your response capabilities and dealing with them. And that's going to be something that's going to pay us dividends down the line. Is we're getting better at the response capability. So even if the bad man does get in, our ability to detect it, respond to it, minimize the harm done by it, learn from it, continuously improve our world, and do better at what we're trying to do, it's inevitable as well. Ben, what do you think?
It was a really good interview. I thought it was a little more optimistic than I would have been on this. To me, we're coming off this year where there was a lot of promise for a federal data privacy statute in Congress that didn't materialize. And I think there's less of a chance of it happening over the next couple of years. But I think this interview could make you more optimistic just because there is a lot of innovation at the state level. There are now several models out there, both from GDPR and other countries, as to how to set up data privacy regimes. So I take away a little optimism from the interview.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, our thanks to Chris Gray for joining us. We do appreciate him taking the time. This episode of The Cyberwire is made possible in part by CrowdSec. CrowdSec helps rebalance the asymmetrical cybersecurity industry by making their open-source multiplayer firewall available to all for free. Once threats are identified, all users are notified to ensure everyone's protection. No matter what your business size, CrowdSec offers adaptive response to credential stuffing, port scans, password brute forcing, and much more. At CrowdSec, they have each other's backs and make the internet safer together. Visit crowdsec.net to learn more. That is our show. We want to thank all of you for listening. The Caveat podcast is proudly produced in Maryland at the startup studios of Data Tribe, where they're co-building the next generation of cybersecurity teams and technologies. Our senior producer is Jennifer Eiben. Our executive editor is Peter Kilpie. I'm Dave Bittner.
And I'm Ben Yellen.
Thanks for listening.